Hey everyone, this is Matt, producer of the Hayek Program Podcast. If you've ever wondered to yourself, gosh, when is the Hayek Program Podcast going to have some merchandise available? Well, now we do. If you go to www.mercatusmerch.com, you'll find Mercatus' new podcast merchandise store, where the Hayek Program Podcast has a tote bag, a mug, and a water bottle available for purchase. It's just in time for the holidays too, so you can go grab one for yourself, a friend, or a family member. And for our listeners, if you use the promo code Hayek at checkout, you'll get 10% off your purchase. Once again, that's www.mercatusmerch.com and use the promo code Hayek to save 10% at checkout. And as always, we'd love to have you share the latest episode with those in your orbit. Word of mouth is the primary way we grow the podcast, and we are always eager to keep the conversation going with other lifelong learners. Thank you so much for being a great audience, and with that, let's get to the episode.
You're listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Today is November 8th, 2022, Election Day, and I am here with Professor Ben Powell, the director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University and a professor of economics in the business school at Texas Tech University. Ben, thanks a lot for coming on here with me.
Hey, Pete, anytime that I can hang out with you is a good time.
All righty. I'm going to dive right into it. I want to talk a little bit about how you got interested in free market economics and whatnot when you were an undergraduate. So if you could just talk about what interested you when you were a kid and got excited and what books influenced you so that others can see that intellectual train of thinking.
Sure. Well, I didn't start off with coming from an undergrad place where there were great free market thinkers, quite the contrary, really. I did my undergraduate at University of Massachusetts at Lowell. It's populated by people who graduated from Boston area schools for the most part, who are professors. And at that time, I guess we're kind of unreformed Keynesians for the most part, or left-leaning otherwise. But I started actually as an accounting major and found that boring and switched to finance. But as I kept taking economics courses, the logic of economics was far more compelling than what I was doing elsewhere. And just started taking more and more, despite not really having an affinity with, or an ideological affinity with the faculty. Still, the logic of economics is the logic of economics, and that was attractive. But I specifically came to more of the learning systematically, or not learning more about free market ideas, kind of accidentally when I was an undergraduate. I went to a weekend seminar by the Leadership Institute, Morton Blackwell's group there in DC, and it was more political than it was economics, but they throw books to you in the crowd when you answer questions. And, they threw me Capitalism and Freedom. So I read Friedman, and I thought, wow, this is way better than the stuff I've been getting in class. I like this a lot more. And so I read a little bit more about him and found out that Hayek was his colleague for a time at Chicago. So I read Road to Serfdom. Then I found out Mises was his teacher. So I started reading some Mises, and then found Rothbard. It just kind of went on my own path reading as an undergrad, and started thinking that I'd like to become a professor, but I wasn't sure. And then one summer, I think between my junior and senior years, I went to Mises University and spent a week there listening to professors who, like you, Pete, and like me today, are passionate about these ideas, are hardcore in their beliefs. And I was like, wow, this is so refreshing compared to what my standard undergrad education was. And I'd like to definitely. I went into that week thinking I would like to become a professor. I left that week knowing that that's what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. which incidentally is kind of fun. Like one example of this, I remember Pete, you'll appreciate this. Rich Vedder was giving lectures there that year.
Yeah.
But he's up at the blackboard, and he gets really energetic when he's talking, and sliver's flying out of his mouth. He's got big, thick glasses. His hair's kind of going both ways. He's got chalk on his belly from rubbing up against the chalkboard. And I'm watching him and passionately talk about, I think, international trade or something. And I remember thinking, oh, when I get older, I want to be like that guy.
That is awesome.
Kind of odd for a 20-year-old.
Two things about your story, which is kind of fascinating, I think. The first one is that, I always used to say to people that the most left-wing economist, Larry Summers, let's say, is more right-wing than the most right-wing sociologist, right? And because they believe in constraints, and then they pursue the logic of choice within constraints. Not because of any big ideological thing, just because of the logic of economics. I wonder whether or not that is still true in economics, in the way that economics is taught nowadays. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that. I think something's happened in the way that economics is taught outside of, your program at Texas Tech and outside of our program here and a few other little pockets. But economics has become much more like theory-less and just, big data and driven by a lot of, kind of very strong ideological priors on the left. So otherwise, our good friend Phil Magnus couldn't find mistakes in professors from Berkeley, right? That are dealing with income inequality and whatnot. The second thing is that I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Mises Institute at the time, because among the professors, you mentioned Vedder, but I was just wondering if like DiLorenzo was there and what kind of topics he was still talking about. I just had a colleague contact me about DiLorenzo last night because, there's this emergence of the structure, conduct, performance paradigm in IO. And this person went and did a deep dive into DiLorenzo, and they were like, oh my God, he wrote these great papers. And I was like, yes, he did. He was phenomenal. He was one of my best, professors when I was a graduate student, before he left to go take the job first at Chattanooga and then to Loyola. But I mean, he just wrote some really, really great papers. Then he also did a lot of economic history stuff, which I'm just wondering what he was talking about when he was down at the Mises Institute, or you ran into him, or if Higgs was still talking at the Mises Institute then. So just who were your lecturers there?
So Tom definitely was, and he was doing a mix of things back then. So this is shortly after, not too long after Murray Rothbard passed away. DiLorenzo, he definitely lectured on antitrust stuff there, which was some of the stuff that I actually liked best in the readings I was doing, prepping for that back when I was an undergraduate. And his lectures were fantastic. So were Rich's. Joe Salerno, of course, was there, was a staple. Tom, he did the antitrust stuff, but he was also doing Lincoln stuff then, but before he had written a Lincoln book. So there was a mix of history and straight up, antitrust price theory type work. Definitely one of the more dynamic lecturers there, who was inspiring to watch.
He was a great teacher and a great pragmatic advice giver to young economists on how to build a career. He just was phenomenal. And, young people sometimes, they come into these things years later and they never see, those aspects of people because they're writing something new now, or they're doing something else and, they're moving on or whatever. But those papers by DiLorenzo, were just top-notch stuff. He was great.
Yeah, the profession needs to rediscover DiLorenzo of the 1980s on antitrust and Armentano.
Yeah, I'm teaching Armentano this semester, and the students were asking me about projects. So I said, here's a project for you. Armentano showed you from 1890 to 1980 the antitrust case history. 1980 was a long time ago now. So you could do 1980 to 2020, and you could do exactly what Armentano did, the case history, and try to demonstrate again what cases were these so-called monopolists restricting output and raising price rather than actually, increasing output and lowering price. And so therefore, antitrust is the strategic use of government by businesses to crack down on competitors, right? And, can you show that? And I said, that would be phenomenal to do, just do that. And I was also talking about DiLorenzo's papers, and, his predatory pricing paper and a bunch of other ones, all of which have been forgotten. Yeah. And they have to be rediscovered.
And Pete, I think what you're articulating, and you're great at doing this with working with grad students, is a progressive research program for a PhD student to start in their dissertation and to develop into a full-blown research program going forward. But because it's a missing gap in our kind of arsenal of practitioners right now, because back when I was a student 20 years ago working with you, this was stuff we all knew from reading these guys, but the argument was kind of won and the profession had moved on. So like, oh, why would we work on that? Just like then, you see waves of these things of, after the financial crisis, a whole bunch of young people start working in the Austrian tradition, start working on money and banking again. And it's responding to this. Antitrust needs that now.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Anyway, I just, it was, it's good applied economics with a passion for understanding the nuances of the beauty of economic reasoning that I thought that, a lot of those organizations, filled in gaps at that time. So anyway, you get this additional education and you're excited about becoming a professor. I like the idea of looking at Vedder and saying, I want to be like that. When my undergraduate teacher, I asked him about being a professor, he told me that it's a fantastic job because you only work 12 hours a week. And at that time, I was still really interested in being involved in a bunch of other things that I wanted to do. And so the idea that I could work 12 hours a week, then I could have a bunch of other time to do the other things. I thought that was awesome. So you make a decision to go off to graduate school. You're from New England. There's lots of schools up there. What drove your decision matrix in terms of, narrowing down schools and the process of doing that?
Yeah, well, I applied at a few different places, but there was no decision once I got a fellowship offer at George Mason at that time. So this would be, I guess,
Texas Tech didn't exist at that time.
No, Texas Tech didn't have this type of center going on. There was, Auburn was kind of winding down its PhD program that had that influence at that time. NYU wasn't really on my radar. So when George Mason came through with the fellowship, that's where I was going, no doubt about it. And, when I say George Mason, when Pete Boettke and department came through, because you were relatively, 3 years back at George Mason, then 2 years back at George Mason?
I was just back. And 2 years, maybe. 2000 you came?
I showed up in fall of 2000, so spring of 2000.
Yeah, so that was my second year there.
Yeah.
Stringham came my first year. And so he would have been was he a third year graduate student when you were?
When I was
then it was my third year.
Yeah. But, it's kind of fun here. When I came down to visit, we talked about Austrian economics, and I was pretty raw back then. I think I got my fellowship because of my knowledge of zone defense in basketball. You were wearing a windbreaker suit and apologized that you were going to a basketball practice later that day. So we started talking about that, and I was coaching a travel team. And now that when I look back at the stuff I wrote in my application, I'm like, I think he was more impressed with the basketball than the economics.
No, you have. I had keen recognition of the talent you come in and you have Stringham ahead of you. I always forget who's in the class right above you. My mistake. Bob Subrick is there. But other than that, I'm not sure that, Derek Yonai, I guess, maybe, and a couple others, but I don't really remember them as much as like Stringham and Virgil in that 98 class. But in your class, you have Scott and yourself, as well as Ann Bradley, at least, and then some others, Jason Osborne and some others but I mean, Ann and Scott and yourself, you've gone on to have, great academic success in your various different avenues of which you've done that. Talk a little bit about your cohort and your experience at Mason at the time. You're a Brian Kaplan is sort of coming into his own, right, while you're in graduate school. So he doesn't yet have out The Myth of the Rational Voter, but those articles that make that up are first starting to come out. What tell the listeners a little bit about what was going on at that time and your cohort.
Yeah, it was a fantastic time to be at GMU and to learn from each other as well as from our professors. And I think of that cohort not as like a single year, but kind of like you said, starting with Stringham's class and then extending to the year behind me too, right? Because you have Leeson and Coyne there as well as Ryan Opria, and I spent just as much time with those three guys as I did with people in my own class and ahead of me. Um, and some of this is just kind of lucky that we show up at the same time and can push each other. But I think you're exactly right that it was a great time educationally to be at GMU. As you said, you were just back there, which is important to work with you, but also at that time, because you didn't have the huge load of students and other obligations you do now. So it was a much more one-on-one personal time at a cohort with that whole group of students together, really. I'm not sure that interaction's is easy to do anymore. So there was that, but there was also, in terms of like so Austrian economics is exciting again at George Mason in a way that it kind of quieted down for a little while. And Stringham's a big guy at encouraging this among graduate students that, guys, we can publish in this and we can get jobs afterwards. Don't listen to people who tell you got to do empirical something or other. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but just don't listen to the BS. There's that, but there's also at this time, well, you mentioned Brian's there with an exciting new research agenda related to public choice and obviously knowledgeable about Austrian economics, and you're there. But Buchanan and Tulloch, this is kind of the end of their stage of active engagement on a day-to-day basis in the program. So you still have that tradition you get to take classes from and interact. And a year later, you have Vernon Smith in his lab showing up. And the conflux of these, a kind of resurgent Austrian program among professors, a new surge in experimental but related to the political economy tradition that we care about, and still the legacy of the founders of public choice being there, I think set up the blend of interest that makes it a great environment when you get an enthusiastic cohort of students who want to push each other to embrace
Yeah.
all of those research
You
projects and learn.
you got to interact with Tulloch some.
Oh yeah, Tulloch was a blast.
Have any memorable Tulloch stories? Everyone has a Tulloch story.
Oh, everybody has plenty. I
Yeah.
took his class, Topics in Public Choice, which really meant Gordon Tulloch in Public Choice. That would meet twice a week in the morning, and all you'd read is Gordon's books. And
Yeah.
the first day of class, and this is great because it's election day, he points to the first student because he never called on you or he never let you raise your hand. He just points. Why is democracy good without giving me the definition of democratic? And
Right.
guy gets a few words in, it's definition of democratic. And he goes around the room like this. And he finally gets to me. And I said something about kills fewer of its citizens maybe than dictatorships. But then I just started trashing democracy. And he said, if you don't like democracy, you must be an anarchist. Anarchists believe in private roads. Anarchists believe in building glass bridges over private roads. People who believe in glass bridges are insane. You, sir, are insane. and moved on. And of course, that I didn't know it at the time. I'm like, what the hell is this? There was a ton that semester that was great. I ended up in that class, and I guess I had Ann Bradley in that one with me and Scott Bollier. I don't think Leeson and Coyne were because they were in their first year when I was taking. I was risk averse because I was in second year classes, and usually that was like an elective for third year, but I didn't know how long
Right.
Gordon would be around. So I'm like, I got to take Gordon's classes first chance I can. But I bore the brunt of his arguments in that class, and it was great fun for at least 2 out of the 3 months.
Now, so with you took my class in constitutional, and all I remember about that is Chris and Pete were in that class, and you guys just railed on me the entire time about how Buchanan was a statist and everything. And it was quite kind of fascinating to be in the position of having to, defend, similar, position on Buchanan. The
Yeah, that was
so
great. And by the way, Pete, what comes out of that too, right? Is Stringham was driving part of that and puts
yeah,
together that book, Anarchy, State, and Public Choice, that's going back to
yeah.
the Tulloch volumes from the 70s. Yeah, that was great fun to be able to battle with. Well, that's one thing that you did great as a faculty, is you allowed your students who are really into this to argue with you in class.
Well,
That
we had a blast.
provides
We
for
had
a
a
great,
blast.
great learning environment.
The issue with Stringham, that I am always very grateful to him, is that when I returned to George Mason, the zeitgeist among the students was that Austrian economics was stupid, and Ed not only wasn't going to take any of that, he was aggressively not going to take it. And so it was weird because I actually had Stringham was the one that was more aggressive, and then I followed his lead in some sense. Was like, like, Stringham's right, look at the record. People get jobs by doing this. And because the claim was, like always, that you can't publish, you can't get a job, you need to not do it like this or whatever. And it was said very vociferously by the same type of students who said it when I was a student, which are empirical public choice guys who weren't even very happy that Buchanan was still teaching, right? I mean, when I was a graduate student and I was taking Jim Buchanan or Kenneth Boulding, who I thought were like economic royalty, my classmates that were of a different bent used to make fun of me. Like, why am I taking these old men? And then, of course, Buchanan won a Nobel Prize and they stopped saying things. But people forget, between 1884 and 86, Buchanan didn't win the Nobel Prize. And so he was just like this old guy that was talking, philosophy as far as they're concerned. And they thought they were doing science. And, it was an interesting dynamic. And I came back to George Mason and in 1998, after being gone for 10 years, and the same thing was going on. I was like, what the hell? It's like Rip Van Winkle. Like, I woke up and now I got this. But the thing is that Stringham would like make fun of, it's not like Stringham would just simply argue with him. He literally would make fun of them. And it was like, oh, okay, I got like this guy here who, is willing to like take the lead. And he was great. I mean, I have to say, having Ed there was phenomenal.
Yeah, he was very, very important.
Really helped build the program.
Very important for the culture of the cohort of students that I was involved with.
Well, he encouraged me to do things, and I said, "Yeah, this is good. You'll appreciate this." We had the seminar on Fridays at that time, and the idea is that people would come and visit us on Fridays, and then go to NYU on Mondays, right? So we could share, visitors. But then we did it late in the afternoon, so then we finished it with a wine and cheese. We'd have wine and cheese. That was Ed's idea.
All right.
And my idea was, we're in Virginia, we're the Virginia school, so we're going to use Virginia wines. And then yes. And Lauren Lemaski, I brought Lauren in, and Lauren's like shuddered and said, "This is an Austrian seminar. The wines are supposed to be from the real Vienna, not from Vienna, Virginia." And so anyway, I used to do that, get the Virginia wines, but I mean, we had the wine and cheese on Fridays, and anyway, it was great. And Ed was significant part of that culture, as was you. I was going to say before, when you did your cohort, one of the biggest difference between GMU and Texas Tech is we don't have a natural like meeting place off campus. That's in Arlington we did, but not in Fairfax. Fairfax is more suburban, spread out kind of thing. And you became kind of a social focal point. You had your opening weekend barbecue, and people would meet at that and talk and learn ideas and see who their cohort was and all of that stuff. And so I think that was, again, very valuable to creating that kind of social culture within the students.
Yeah, I mean, I've always tried to do that, mostly just for my own enjoyment, but also really
Yeah,
when I was a grad student, but everywhere I was, in San Jose too, Suffolk with the PhD students, not so much the faculty, and certainly here at Tech. But part of it, it's subject to constraints here in the Fairfax area. It's tougher, just like it was when I was at Suffolk in Boston, because the faculty are more spread out. It's a bigger pain for people to drive, and there's
right,
higher opportunity costs later in the day. So
right.
I always wanted to have a Friday seminar at Suffolk with a social hour afterwards, and no one would come to campus then. You had to squeeze it in at lunchtime on a Tuesday or Wednesday or something.
Right.
Versus Tech, nobody lives more than 20 minutes away from the office here. And Friday afternoon after seminar, my colleagues and PhD students are probably the people I want to most hang out with in town anyway. So it's
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah,
great.
yeah. It's I can't. I'll talk about Texas Tech in a little bit, but I can't recommend it enough, actually, for young people to really think about it, for graduate school and junior faculty to think about if they see an opening there to jump at it, especially in the economics department, which maybe we'll talk about, uh, but but maybe not, and we'll just leave it at that. All right, so you finished graduate school, and you publish. Stringham publishes. The whole group of you are publishing, both in books that you're creating, but also in journal articles. You work with Bennett, actually, at the Journal of Labor Research, and you published a paper in the Journal of Labor Research, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, that came later, not as a grad student. That was a couple of years out.
Oh, that was after you were at San Jose State?
Yeah, because Dave Scarbeck co-authored with me, and Dave was my undergrad student when I first arrived at
Yeah.
San Jose State. So that was a
Okay.
project out of class, I think my first year there, maybe.
Okay.
But this is actually worth mentioning too, because I know with PhD students at George Mason and at Tech, the kind of expectations we have for them on publishing, when we talk about what they need to do to be able to secure good jobs, and what the expectations were a lot. The bar was lower, I think, at GMU when I was there to be thought of as doing research as a grad student and doing it
Uh,
well. I think I might have had 6 or 7 publications, but they weren't all in journals.
yes,
The
they were
book
in books
chapters.
and stuff.
So I think
Yeah.
my when I was for journal articles when I was leaving GMU, maybe a public choice, a Cato journal, a quarterly journal of Austrian economics, and
Yeah.
maybe one other, something like that. And that was considered like, oh wow, you're doing fantastic at that time. And
Yeah.
that's the type of thing that
But I
was
think the
wanted
world's
normal.
I do think that the world's changed a bit. I'm not trying to poo-poo anything like that, but the very cohort that you're talking about, as well as other people, have gone on to become editors, co-editors, and also referees at these places. At the time when you were coming out, the random referee that you were given at a place that, like, say, other people are getting now would have been hostile, right? It would have been hostile for the very approach. And now that's not the case. Referees look at it and say, oh, that's a reasonable position. The world's changed to some extent. I think that pendulum's swinging back a little bit now in the direction that it once was. But so I don't think that you guys. So what I'm saying is, I think you guys published at that time that if you were writing those same papers today, I want to get to this in a second because I think actually this is an important thing. You might disagree with me on this. I think some of those papers potentially, with another round of revision, could have been in better journals today. But at that time, what would have been required to pass the argumentative bar would have been much higher, and would have been, you would have wasted a lot of years trying to chase after that, I think.
Yeah, that might be the case, and I might have undershot back at that time too, because I think uh, through at least the first 4 years after GMU, I think I only had maybe one rejection,
Yeah.
which means I probably should have been trying to place them higher and struggling more with them then, and either that or is exactly optimal, and but that's pretty unlikely.
I mean, life has turned out pretty good for you, so you followed a pretty optimal path. But the reality is that there's an old adage, right? Deans can't read, but they can count. And, if you're trying to compete in a very competitive game, let's say a tenure track job at an R1 university, there's two strategies to follow. One is high impact placement, and the other one is lots of placements that in net have high impact, right?
Yeah.
So you're both having an impact in both ways. And maybe nowadays we advise students a little bit more to be a little bit more careful and shoot for higher impact journals. And at that time we were more like, but just publish. But what I introduce the students to, and I don't know how you'll react to this. I don't think that you'll disagree with it. But I try to tell the students that,
well, give me a chance.
yeah, I give them a picture of a set of concentric circles, and I say that all research is research in progress. So, right, and writing is research. So you need to learn how to write. We are professional writers for a living, and we need to learn how to do our craft. And so then I draw a set of concentric circles, and I have at the core the JPE API. And then I have at the concentric circle way out JPE Chicago, right? And my argument is that along the way between JPE API and JPE Chicago, there's lots of journals that expand our network of who you're reaching, but they're not necessarily. So it's not like an either or. I'm writing either for API or I'm writing for the JPE, which is what you hear a lot of people try to say, like when you go to these conferences and they try to give you advice or whatever. So I'm always like, look, there's, the public choice, the REE, the QJAE, constitutional political economy. There's, Southern Economics Journal. There's Economic Inquiry. There's places like that. Then there's, and you try to learn how to expand your reach. That's a skill that you have to learn. And I guess that one of the things I wanted to ask you when we pivot a little bit to your research is about learning this argumentative bar, because I think that that's one of the things that you have become really kind of a master at. But first, tell us a little bit about your experience at SJSU, the work that you did with Stringham out there, which was also policy as well as academic, and as well as teaching and program building. I mean, you guys built something at SJSU which wasn't there before. You had master students and everything. And then, as you said, you went to Suffolk, and then you go to Texas Tech where you're given this opportunity. You've learned a lot. You did that pretty quickly, right? I mean, how many years out were you when you went to Texas Tech? Were you even 10 years out?
Yeah, just about.
Just about 10 years.
Yeah, I was 4 years at San Jose and 5.5 at Suffolk.
Right. So 10 years out, and you are given this opportunity to build this major research center, which you had to build from scratch. So first you have what skills you learned to help put you in that position, and then what skills you learned on the fly to be able to pull off what you have pulled off.
Yeah. So you have a whole lot that you talked about right there. Let's
sorry.
Stick with the journal thing first, and then let's go to the kind of institutional building stuff. So I think I was very fortunate at San Jose State to start my career there, also working with Ed and Jeff Hummel and a number of good people, that the concentric ring thing there, you were pretty free there to be able to earn tenure publishing lots of different ways. And I was concerned with becoming known as a producer first and foremost. So I worked on lots of different things, including the public policy stuff and outreach stuff at the same time as working on journal articles, and selectively would push towards quality here or there, but I had a lot of freedom there. And that allowed me to learn how to write a lot better. Working 2 days a week with Independent Institute and having to write policy type stuff and op-eds with them, but then being pushed into the media past comfort zone on a regular basis and to public debate involving inclusionary zoning. It was learning a lot of different skills at once, and kind of had the freedom because we didn't have to shoot for a particular short list of journals while we were there. So you didn't exclude those, but you didn't focus narrowly that way. So it built a broader skill set that definitely became useful later when looking to get going here at Texas Tech. Going to Suffolk, the journal focus narrowed a little bit. There was a new PhD program that was trying to be conscientious about improving on quality. And most of my effort there was working with our PhD students there. I had actually excellent cohort of students that I worked with in the 5.5 years that I was there, who were really
very, very talented and energetic kids.
For coming out of a program that was a new PhD program, who all got tenure track jobs and have established research programs, and some of them leadership roles in this aspect of the profession, I think have done fantastic. And then coming to Texas Tech, so the institution building part is something that I've always been, my time at George Mason was so fantastic with the cohort of students and faculty as around the research program. Once you leave, I was always looking to how can we recreate some aspect of this. And at San Jose State with Ed Lopez and Ed Stringham and Jeff Hummel and some others that we were trying to do this there with the master's level. At Suffolk, I was working with David Turk, who had done his PhD with Buchanan back in the 60s at UVA, and trying to create that environment for our PhD students there, which was good in the department, but the university wasn't the right environment for the graduate research program the same way. And then Tech came along with this opportunity. Actually, Pete, I remember you called me, or called or emailed. So either way, my reaction was the same. When you first said something, Ben, would you be interested in going to West Texas to start a new program? And I said, why? Well, I'll make it nicer. Why the hell would I do that? It's just an edited version of my real comment. But then again, here I am. After I started talking to him, I realized what the opportunity was. And your phrase when you said it is, I had to start my own program here. And I would phrase it, I got to start my own program here. Because, of course, Texas Tech has an ag econ department, a business school econ department, an arts and sciences. There's been stuff going on here for a while, but the Free Market Institute itself was founded by a donation before I got here, but I was the first person hired with the mandate to hire staff and then initially just 2 more faculty to get started. But this means that I got to put the team together. And Pete, you've coached travel teams before. When you get to pick the players, it's a lot more fun than when you get handed the roster and said, "What the hell exactly. You got to do?"
I went to when I was coaching at the local high school, I went to a coaching clinic with Jay Wright, and Jay Wright called the coach of Villanova. And he called me out, and he was asking me. He says, where do you coach? And I said, oh, the local high school. And this is, and he laughed, and he said, the local public high school? And I said, yeah. And he said, man, I can't say what he said to the group of audience there, but he said, you got a set on you, basically. He says, because he goes, I would never coach in anything but a Catholic school where I can recruit. He goes, I don't want to show up and have a 5'5" kid be my center because that's just the luck of the draw of the high school that year or whatever. And I was just sitting there smiling, and I got home and I called my brother and I told him this story, and he said, that's why the public high school coaches are better, because they can win with just a random draw of talent. And I'm like, but I wonder why it is that all the good coaches actually go and coach in the Catholic schools or go coach in the private university, high schools before they go to college. Anyway, I do think that that was, I want to come back to what you've done at Texas Tech, but I want to give you a chance to talk a little bit about at least 3 of your books, and mainly 2 of them, because it relates to this research thing that I was talking about, which is that, one of the things that you've done in Out of Poverty and Wretched Refuse is that you have chosen to argue with professional economists, right? And try to raise the argumentative bar so that the argument doesn't just please Ben Powell, but pleases or convinces other people in rather, very convincing fashion. So in Out of Poverty, it's about sort of the rate of development that takes place as we move from sweatshops into sort of advanced sort of productive activity. And the benefits of the sweatshop for development. I think one of the really interesting arguments that you give in there is, how long it took in England, how long it took in the United States, how long it took in East Asia or whatever, and this development process. But even in Wretched Refuge, you even go even higher, which is this issue of the cultural aspects of immigration and whether or not the immigrants bring bad, quote unquote, bad culture to the country that they move to, or whether or not they move because they're adopting the culture of the country they want to move to. And you treat, you're taking on George Borjas. It's not like you're taking on Mickey Mouse, right? You're taking on George Borjas. In the first book, you're kind of leveraging economists. So you're adopting even Paul Krugman to defeat people that are anti-sweatshops. But in the second book, you are really taking on very mainstream economists who have tried to raise this question, and you're challenging that. Talk a little bit about the learning in that process of between those two books.
Yeah, so the first one, Out of Poverty, which, by the way, we should talk about offline afterwards, because I think I'm inspired to do a second edition on that.
Okay.
Working on some new projects related to it now. But it's the outcome. I had done this article with Dave Scarbeck comparing the wages, and I started giving public talks, particularly on campus, but other places too, and debates on the topic. And over time, my lecture on it got bigger and bigger than what my research articles were, and it became obvious I could pull this together. The book's really kind of the outcome of a series of debates and lectures where I started covering the bigger process of development. And my analytical framework is a mix of standard price theory, UCLA insights, Austrian economics, public choice, but not everything I do is obviously and explicitly that. And I think you and other people who are careful in reading see a very Austrian interpretation of development in that Out of Poverty book. But I think if you hand it to a normal mainstream trained economist, they don't notice that. They notice a description of a process of development, which might be a little bit different, but doesn't jump off the page as being radically outside of mainstream thought.
I mean, Milton Friedman was right in the end, Ben. There's only good economics and bad economics. It's just that good economics is pays attention to some of these issues that we care about.
Yeah, I agree. It's always motivated me in terms of, so honestly, my research program in some sense is whatever's pissing me off is what I tend to work on and bring those type of insights to applied issues that I think are a big deal and can make a difference in the world. So I don't mind working on controversial things, obviously. In fact, I kind of like it. All else equal, people pay more attention if you work on stuff that has that. And Sweatshops had that flavor to it when I was working on that book. The book's now, I guess, 10 years that it's been out, which is why it's kind of in need of an update. And a lot of that was taking on interdisciplinary stuff, not so much economists as business ethicists as well, who staked out more of a position on it than, as you say, Paul Krugman back when he was an economist, and it used to be bad on this issue.
No, they understood this. I just was going to say something about that real quick, and then I'll let you continue, which is that I think it's important for the listeners to contextualize what the world was like 10 years ago with regard to sweatshops. So there was a priest at St. John's that got a player on the soccer team to refuse to wear his Nike jersey, because of the sweatshop issues. And the kid lost his scholarship for it, because, obviously St. John's is getting Nike gear for a reason. And, the priest convinced it. That's the kind of argument that was all over the universities at the time. And I remember thinking, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I was watching a golf tournament and Phil Mickelson had a KPMG hat on. And I turned to somebody, I was in a big function, and I said, I wonder how much the hell he gets paid to wear that hat. And the guy was in there was from KPMG, and he says, I know exactly. He gets paid $1 million a year to wear the KPMG hat and show up at our corporate outing once a year and hit the tee shot on the 18th hole for everyone or whatever, right? That's what he does. And I turned to the guy and I said, damn it. I said, I want Nike to pay me $1 million a year, and I'll wear a giant Nike hat and teach all my economics lectures about why it's okay that they're like stitching soccer balls in a factory somewhere like that. And I said, I should get paid that. And everyone in the room just stared at me like I was insane, like that. But that's the world that you were entering into. There was protests on campus. They wanted to divest, from Nike and whatnot. And then you're showing this whole thing about the necessity of, if you don't get on the bottom of the economic ladder, there's no way you can climb up the economic ladder, basically.
Well, first, if you don't understand price theory, you're as likely to hurt these workers as you are to help them. So what I try to do in that research program is adopt. So this is a very Austrian type welfare analysis here. It's a means ends analysis. They say what the ends are: workers of the third world, not Pete Boettke's $1 million for a Nike swoosh hat while economics. And now the question is, how do we improve it? And what I try to do in that work is say, not only use economics to say your solutions don't work and make it worse, but there's a better way forward that includes the main way historically has been the process of development. But it does also relate to the immigration stuff, because the other way is give them better opportunities. That means visas to come to places where their opportunity cost is higher than where they live, which kind of segued into doing some of the immigration research. In fact, the first time I debated immigration was with Peter Brimlow in front of the Philadelphia Society. And I think I was a substitute for you. I think you were supposed to talk on that, and they got me in. So I got to debate Brimlow. And I got invited for more and more immigration lectures over time. And I wrote pop pieces on a journal article or two, but it wasn't a big part of my research program until actually I got to Texas Tech. Because at that point, it occurs to me, it's seeing that it's not that immigration's hotly debated among economists, but what economists debate on immigration is like this little narrow gap, and they do it vigorously. If you look at some of the debates about the Muriel boat lift and what effect it has on wages of non-high school graduates in Miami, these people are bombarding each other with studies and different empirical techniques to sort it out, calling each other frauds basically on their data of sample selection sometimes. And it's all boiling down to like, does it have no effect on the wages of high school dropouts, or like a negative 7% effect for like 2 years? And I'm like, if you're like talking about like doubling world GDP, if you free people to move, if it's the worst version of that, who gives it? And Borhaus then published this article in the Journal of Economic Literature, where, he makes the claim of, there's not this is in response to your new colleague, Michael Clemens, his great article, the classic $1 trillion bills on the sidewalk, where he's talking about the global gains from more open migration. And Borhaus's response is, but this all predicates the institutions that are responsible for the productivity in the destination country remaining unchanged. If those were to deteriorate, then not only do you not get the gains from the immigrants, but you could actually, the intuitive way of talking about this is, if all the Cuban immigrants from Cuba came to Miami and turned Florida socialist, they wouldn't get rich moving to Florida, and Floridians would get poor. Now, that's the idea behind Borhaus basically here. I mean, there's multiple channels it could take, but that's the general transmission mechanism. And so it occurred to me, well, that's an empirical conjecture, and empirical conjectures require empirical evidence. Let's start thinking through some of the sort mechanisms, the selection biases of who moves, how they select where to go, but then also looking at the evidence of this. And that's what Wretched Refuse didn't start out being a book. It started out being a one paper that I did with a few co-authors responding to Borhaus, and I sent it to George, and he responded back something. It was a cross-country study of economic freedom and migration stocks and flows. And he says, it has all the benefits and all of the drawbacks of any cross-country study. What I'd like to see is a large exogenous shock of immigrants and what it does to institutions in a modern welfare state. And I was like, I'm reading it, and I'm like, well, duh, Israel. Everybody's used Israel for labor market impacts and stuff from when the Soviet immigration restrictions going away.
Right. Yeah.
So I did the next study on that, and the same time, Alex Narasta was Alex was involved in that one with me, starting to do some studies, and we collaborated back and forth on a few. And eventually, each one of these journal articles doesn't have a very big exclamation point at the end. They all have drawbacks of how. So you talk about evidentiary standards. I viewed every one of them as very imperfectly addressing a very important question. So huge amount at stake, really hard to get good evidence. I'll say bad evidence that I could do in any one of the articles, said a little bit, but not a lot. And I started thinking, when we put all the different ones together that have the different limitations, in the end, they say something bigger together. And
Right.
that's what that book became. And still, the closing chapter explicitly says there's no QED here. It's not that immigrants couldn't ever come with them and bring norms that undermine the values of the destination country in a way, this is important, in a way that undermines productivity. The argument's not that immigrants don't bring values with them, that they don't change a society. It's that they don't do so in a way that destroys destination country productivity in those
Right.
places that are now rich and relatively freer. But that the weight of the evidence with all these different kind of imperfect takes at it say, if this was an overall thing, as George Borjas just blurts out and says it is and then models, we should be picking up some of it. That we don't have any of it, the burden of proof is upon you who would restrict immigration and deny these massive gains. That Brian, I think your colleague Brian Kaplan, argues convincingly in some of his work that basically almost every major moral standard, if the economics is right, would say we should have much greater immigration flows.
Yeah.
So,
Freedom.
so again,
I think
if you could take between those two books, the sweatshop book, I have a very high degree of confidence in my answers being right. The immigration book, I think, is an even more important question. And I attach a lower probability that my evidence is right, but I think it's better than what anybody else has done so far.
Yeah. But I think you're also very explicit about that, which is one of the reasons why you can engage in the conversation. It's not like you're trying to engage in insulating stratagems or anything like that. I think that among, like your generation of Austrian economists, I mean, first of all, your cohort in general, what you talked about, they have been able to communicate with very mainstream economists at a very consistent rate in a way that very few, certainly no cohort of Austrian economists have done since the old guys. Right. So, Morgenstern, Machlup, all of those, they were doing this all the time. And, they reached the level of professional success teaching at Princeton and Harvard and whatnot that, we're far from achieving yet. But in the meantime, no single group of cohort of Austrian economists, I would venture, or Austrian influenced economists, I would venture, have been as successful at bringing aspects of that research program to professional economists as, Chris Coyne and you and, Virgil and Pete Leeson, obviously, and Ryan Oprea, especially. I mean, he's an editor at the AER now. And, again, you were saying I have this unique talent. I do, people will say to me, oh, Ryan's research program has nothing to do with, Austrian economics. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Actually, it does. Take a look at like the way he does that. He couldn't have written that paper had he not spent those early years, doing, the Austrian kind of thing the way he did. Even if he wouldn't say that, but I think he would say that actually. I think Ryan would actually probably say that. But anyway,
single best seminar I've seen at our seminar series at Texas Tech was Ryan's a little over a year ago on operationalizing some stuff about complexity, where it can completely undermine behavioral economics conclusions. It's classic like transaction cost economic stuff. And it comes from, I think it comes from his background that you're describing too. Fantastic stuff.
Yeah, no, Ryan, first of all, Ryan is very talented guy, obviously, and very ambitious, and he's done that. And I think this is so now I'm going to actually so I think that you're because of the way you've approached this, you have addressed this issue of the argumentative bar. It's one of the hardest things that we have to teach our own students about how to be a professional economist. That's part of my JPE to JPE thing, is learning how to do that. But now, I don't think you'll laugh at me, but I think that listeners might laugh at first thing. I actually think you do that in your Socialism Sucks book too. Right? I mean, the Socialism Sucks book has an explanation point as a title, but the book itself is a very, very carefully reasoned book outside of the stories about the beer and everything. So, tell people a little bit about some of the things in terms of the stories that you tell in that book that you get, like Sweden and other kinds of places that you visited and interacted with and learned institutional details about.
Yeah, well, I wrote that one with Bob Lawson too, and Bob's a great observational economist who is strong in the force, and by that I mean the economic way of thinking too. And travels and conversations with him. I mean, the book's a pretty accurate telling of our travels and conversations in that time we did it. And embedded underneath, actually, he and I see economics very similarly, I think. And the kind of comparative, institutional, and Austrian perspectives that come through, and they underlie all of those observations in the book. The question was that the real challenge in that book was if the two of us could write in the style that you need for a pop novel to pull. So like our goal the whole time was to be like, do better economics than PJ O'Rourke, but not quite be as funny.
Yeah, but you have. So I'm gonna say, you have a lot of very just basic observations and summary data that is very relevant to the debates about what these countries are really up to and whatnot.
Well, yeah, and a lot of
going all the way. Yeah, go ahead.
A lot of that, comes. I mean, we're doing a tour around the world here of varieties of capitalism and socialism, and that's Bob's career of the index of economic freedom. So we had some good raw material to work with and tie this all to.
It also goes back to our conversation about DiLorenzo, because one of the things that DiLorenzo taught me when I was a student is he used to tell us that we should always get 3 outputs from any one research project. You should be able to have a research paper that gets published in a journal. You should be able to have a policy paper that gets published by Cato or one of the policy think tanks, and you should have op-eds. Right. And you learn that skill to a max while you were working at Independent. And so that's your SJSU Independent kind of period. And then you brought that, with you. But part of that, as you mentioned, is learning how to communicate to people who aren't necessarily, what's the right word? Captive audience of your undergraduates, that have to listen to you or whatever. Right. So.
Right.
And so you have to learn how to make them, read. How have you done? I just got recently invited to give a talk. I haven't squared it away yet at a local public library here. And you gave a lot of talks that weren't necessarily just to, student groups or whatever with Socialism Sucks. How did that go over?
Oh, it's great. I mean, that was the best speaking tour I've ever done. It was Bob and I did some of it jointly and some of it separately. It was by far the most demand, but it's also the most fun to give because I got to stash a beer under the podium as a prop and drink while giving the talk, get into character. Given the salty language in the book, I was free to be myself in front of the crowd too. The one thing that hasn't happened yet with it, Pete, that eventually will, and I haven't been giving as many of those talks lately, is like socialism, the sweatshops book. I've done so many public talks in that and done them in front of hostile audiences, places where I've had protests. But because it's a sympathetic means ends book, I can do those very comfortably. I'm like, one day I'm going to walk into a Socialism Sucks talk and it's going to have an audience that hates me. And I'm like, oh, this is just going to flop on its face. Because it's just not that style book. I can't convey the same level of empathy to my audience in that as I would be able to on the other.
Out of poverty, you're trying to actually.
Meanwhile, the immigration one, same way. I've done that to very conservative immigration skeptic crowds, but I can do that one as a means ends. I care about freedom. If these people came and destroyed our freedoms, I would be against it too. But now let's take this seriously. And guess what? I'm not a crazy lefty making apologists for immigration. The Socialism Sucks when I someday I'm going to walk in and flop on a talk on that one in a way that I'm quite comfortable with anti-audiences on the other 2 books. That'll be different.
The Out of Poverty book, I mean, that is the thing to stress, is that the bottom line is how to lift up these workers in these dire circumstances. What's the way for them to rise up through the process of development? And I think that's key. All right, I'm going to pivot to the last 2 questions. One of has to do with author's priority of things, but we'll save that one for last. But the first one has to do with I want you to give a little pitch for TTU. I've been a visiting professor at TTU twice now over the 10 years that you've been in operation. For extended period of time. I visited other times. I think it's one of the most amazing programs in the country and the world, actually, and the development that's taken place there is phenomenal. Now, I'm biased because I sit also on your board, but I 100% endorse what you're doing there, and I would recommend it to anyone to seriously consider for either graduate school or, as I said, if an opportunity arises. And I think if you look at what people have done when they've taken advantage of the opportunity, let's just look at my colleague, Vincent Geloso. Vincent would not be the economist he is had he not gone to Texas Tech and worked with you guys. And he was there for 2 years, maybe 3 years, but 2 years, I think. And it's just amazing what Vincent, his productivity and everything is. And he gets a lot of that from the period of time there. You have, students that are publishing in very well-known journals, as you said, meeting that, you just had an outstanding student last year that ended up in an R1 and, research university back in his home state. So he's like thrilled. And so anyway, give the pitch for why it is, but keep in mind that I'm recruiting the big guy from Israeli professional basketball as much as you are for this year.
Yeah.
So I think you have a leg up on that one. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So you are biased on my board, but you're also biased as the number one place that I lose students to when I'm trying to get them to come here. So it cuts both ways there. Now, thank you. That's very generous, Pete. I'm thrilled with what we've been able to do as a group here at Tech over the last. It's going to be our 10-year anniversary in the spring. And for getting started here and having Chuck Long join me when we first started to now we have 9 faculty who, we all share a common interest in things related to political economy that you and I care about. But each one of our faculty really has kind of different specializations and different strengths. So, kind of thinking in concentric circles, like you think of like the core faculty when we first got started, very, very tightly aligned in Austrian public choice the same way. But then as we've added faculty, people having interest in that, but having interest in competencies in other areas beyond that that add to our graduate education so that we can round out an overall program. I mean, we do lots of things here at the Free Market Institute, but the core business model is about training PhD students to become future professors who teach about these ideas. And everything else is kind of built around that. Our public programming and our outreach stuff all helps to funnel into that. And we're kind of unique in that we're not a department, we're an institute, we're university-wide, so we can work with people in different departments. We have PhD fellows in applied economics, we have PhD students in political science right now too. And we have faculty who are in both those departments as well as the business school, and some at a satellite branch down at Angelo State too. And we string together our PhD courses across departments. So you basically customize a field of study related to the expertise of the Free Market Institute, and then operationalize that in your research program. And we're 9 faculty, and this year I think 15 PhD fellows. And that right now is about the size we want to be. Maybe if trending up to 20 PhD fellows total across all years eventually. But it's a small environment, very direct engagement, kind of like what my cohort was with you when we were at George Mason, a small cluster within a bigger group, except here that cluster is the whole size of it. And the focus, I mean, a lot of this I learned from you, Pete, about how to mentor grad students and work with them and get them engaged in research projects right away. And that's also true of my excellent colleagues that I have here, all of them, to a person, co-author with PhD students in the department. And that's how we get them learning how to write and do research and eventually doing more of it.
Learning how to give a professional presentation, learning how to teach classes. I mean, it's amazing, all the little things that go into making someone competitive in an increasingly competitive environment.
Well, we've had great luck with that. So we've had postdocs and PhD fellows, and all but one of them have full-time positions here in the U.S. now after 10 years. And actually all but one of those are tenure track academic lines at universities. Another one's a economist for Texas Public Policy Foundation. But for Institute getting started, I've been thrilled with our placements, and I think it's a testament to the quality of the students we're getting in and the quality of the work my colleagues do with me in training the students to get them out. But, I think coming to Texas Tech, or for that matter, George Mason, if you go in economics, despite some of the changes in the profession you're noting, if you come out with a few published research papers, the ability to present and teach, pretty much 100% track record, you get a tenure track academic job that's a pretty good life and can keep doing these things. So it's thrilling to be able to do it here. And West Texas is a fantastic environment. The university structure is actually really supportive of Free Market Institute here. And our West Texas supporters and donors are fantastic. And honestly, I said this a little bit earlier, about the environment of Fairfax, Boston, versus being in Lubbock's, some people, do I want to go out to Lubbock, Texas? It's actually, grad student, you're going to be entirely consumed into your PhD studies anyway. And if you're with the cohort of faculty who are also like that, it's easier to have this type of relationship where our seminars go on Friday afternoons. You see people in the evening, and it's been great. So there's your quick pitch for it, Pete.
Yeah, my utility function is different from others, though, and I would say that it's also the case that Texas Tech owes you some money because during the period of time that you've been there, you've been to the NCAA championship game and Sweet 16, and that's due to your presence, I think, in the box cheering the team on. And so I love watching the energy of the place. Is amazing, and it just creates the whole. It's just an exciting place, and what's happened to Lubbock in the decade since you moved there is amazing too.
Well, I'm glad you phrased it that way, because if the administration read my book about sweatshops and compensating differentials, they'd say that now that we're good at basketball, they should be cutting my pay because I'm getting a much better job because I have access to world-class basketball right near my house.
Yeah, that is true. All right, one last question. So we had a controversy at the end of my interview with Scott Bullier that he insisted that, I asked him a question about his sports, because Scott has, devoted an amazing amount of energy to being a damn good, marathon runner. And he's run in New York, he's run in Boston. And he remembered running in Boston, and he ran, and he loved the fact that you came out to see him and cheer him on, and that you took him on a pub tour after he was done. So that's how he did his recovery. But he said that he introduced you to a term at the end of that because it was a very hot day, and he says you took him without letting him take a shower, so he had to go around with swamp ass. And he says he invented that term, and you use it in your book. And he said that he thinks you should offer him a citation. What do you have to say about that to solve that issue?
Deans are great at taking credit for other people's work. So Scott learned that.
We'll leave it at that. That's awesome, actually. Ben, thank you very much. Congratulations again on the Free Market Institute having its 10th, anniversary, and also for the fantastic work you're doing as a scholar and as a teacher. It's really a credit to you what you've been able to do, and the network of students that are spreading out. One last thing I didn't mention to everyone that they should know, just to understand the magnitude of things. I have been at Ben's public events in Lubbock, where he's had close to 1,000 people in the room to see a public talk. And I've been at Angelo State, where Brian Cutzinger, who's only a second-year professor there, with Eduardo, who's also a second-year professor there, and they get close to 200 kids to come out to listen to an economics talk. Now, that's pretty amazing. You go to a lot of environments and professors can't generate that kind of excitement about the work that they're doing. And so just as besides the longevity of the project, besides the graduate student workshops and whatnot, it's also just the excitement that you're generating about economic reasoning in these environments that your programs have done. And so congratulations for that. Because at the end of the day, our biggest impact is going to be whether or not we impact economic literacy in this country. And it's a huge problem that people can't count. They can't understand what's going on. And we need it at each university and each college, step by step, to beat back the economic illiteracy that's out there. And you're doing a fantastic job of doing that, both in Lubbock, but then in spreading out with all of your prodigy that are going all over the place. So congratulations.
Well, thank you, Pete. Wouldn't be here without you. And thanks for having me on today. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program Podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.